Hello, and welcome to another Old Scams in Shiny New Packages podcast. On these podcasts, we use 20th century experiences and ideas to better understand 21st century scams, risks, and potential approaches. My name is John P. Raberger, and I'm here with my podcasting collaborator, Don Wood. Hello, Don.
Hello, John. How are you doing today?
Good. Today, I would like to talk about something that happened about 100 years ago. In the 1920s, there was the era of the gangster. And these are highlighted in films, and there's some famous ones like Al Capone. And what they would do is they would go around robbing banks. And back then, there was no FBI. The FBI came about because of these gangsters. They could easily cross state lines with their ill-gotten gains, and the state police could not chase them across the lines. And there was a very famous gangster by the name of John Dillinger, and he was a publicity hound back then, and he was famously asked, "Why do you rob banks?" And his reply, "Because that's where the money is." So we flash forward 100 years to modern bad guys. The question is, where do bad guys get information about you if they're trying to scam you? And the answer is mostly from business and other organizations, servers, and databases. And why do they do it? Because that's where the data is. Today, money is data, and some data is money. And so most stolen data that affects you is stolen from essentially what's called a back-end server. It's a server or a database that a business uses that collects a lot of information about everything. It collects information about you as a customer if you've interacted with them. It collects financial information. It collects operational information like orders and production schedules and things like that. And because there's all this data, it is very, very attractive for hackers to try to hack into. And we'll talk about the implications of that. And we'll talk about why hackers are able to do it so frequently. And there have been some high profile hacks associated with it. Does that make sense?
So when we talk about data, and that's such a broad term, John, and we're talking now about hackers getting data, what kind of data are we talking about?
Yeah, what they are looking for is anything that they can use as a scamming mechanism to get more information about potential scam victims, or more broadly, what they do is they sell it on essentially a black market of data. There's a black market of data out there all the time from people who want data to use for their particular scams and people who hack organizations mostly and get data. For example, a basic account credentials, your Gmail username and password is probably worth about $1 to $15 each in volume. Whereas corporate email access is more expensive, and it's generally from $15 to $50, depending on a whole bunch of things in volume. And there's a ready market for all this stuff out on what's called the dark web, which is not really secret. It's just sort of bad guys and how they interact, but that's been going on for a long time. Does that make sense?
So my password, my Gmail password, it's worth about $1, $2 to someone.
Yeah, about in volume. Now they deal with millions of these things.
Now, if they dealt with me personally, I would demand a lot more than $2 for my password. How is it that my password for Gmail, which would unlock all kinds of things that I'm doing and talking about, is only worth $2?
Because they don't know how useful it might be to them in bulk. The people who get the data are not necessarily the people who try to create the scams. For example, some of the passwords they get, let's say they get 1 million usernames and password combinations. They don't know what percentage of those have been changed already They don't know what percentage of those are to dummy or fake accounts or low value email addresses that are just used once and then forgotten. So they do this in volume, and this is the volume pricing. And these guys use computers just like everybody else does and try to massage the data and manage it and stuff like that. So that's just the market price for all this stuff.
So these scammers could be scammed themselves. They could spend, let's say, $100,000 on multitudinous number of emails and passwords, but some of those emails and passwords would be fake, phony, never used, dead accounts, that kind of thing.
Yeah, actually, Google has done a lot of research into actually how scammers actually work. And they essentially have business relationships with each other. So they've known each other for a long time. And so they will sell each other data based upon a market price, but also based on their reputations and how the last batch worked and things like that, too. And so it's unlikely they'll get scammed by somebody they have known and worked with over time, but I'm sure it does happen.
We hear a lot, almost every week, about a data breach at a company. Do these guys ever get caught? Seems like we never hear the other side where there's an arrest. There's a high profile arrest. It just seems to go by the wayside.
No, it does happen, but there's a lot of work that goes into it. And unfortunately, a lot of these companies are in Russia or Albania or China or Africa or literally throughout the world. And it's relatively hard to track them down over time. There are people who try, but most of the companies who get hacked, well, there's all kinds of problems. One is that some companies who get their data stolen don't even know what happened. The best hackers are like the best cat burglars in that somebody copies your data and covers their tracks well enough that you don't even know it happened. And there's other companies that it happens to, and they are worried about legal liability or reputational damage, and so they don't tell anybody. And then there's another group of companies that only find out about it much later from, let's say, a third party or an informant or something like that. And the last group is the ones who find out about it and comply with the laws in the United States about breach reporting and do so relatively quickly, like within months. Unfortunately, the latest data I've been able to find online is that the last group is about 21% of the S&P 500 companies did that in 2023. So that's kind of the floor on at least 21% were hacked. There are other consulting organizations and assessment organizations that say that about 96% of S&P 500 organizations are vulnerable to hacking. And unfortunately, there are very good reasons why that's true. And it has everything to do with, let's say, the cost of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity consultants are expensive, and cybersecurity and other forms of security create an overhead for the organization. For people who have never been in a big organization, it's hard to understand how much cybersecurity people tend to be disliked in these organizations because they increase cost, they make things more of a hassle for people. So, for example, if you're trying to run an operation in a big organization, cybersecurity people, for example, they want standardization across all the devices. The more things are standard, the easier it is to find solutions and to apply patches and updates. And the more heterogeneous a computing environment it is, the more difficult that is. But people want local customization. They want to get the computers they want to get the phones they want to get the devices they want. So they want something that's optimized for their needs. And the cybersecurity people want standardization across the whole organization. The other thing is that cybersecurity people, the ones I've talked to and dealt with in the past, I felt sorry for them because it's a lousy job. Because you can block literally millions of intrusions, but if one single one gets through and causes problems people will blame you. And you may have nothing to do with you, but people will blame you.
Yes.
And the last thing is senior executives are not liable for cybersecurity breaches like they are for financial malfeasance. The Sarbanes-Oxley law, which came as a result of the Enron crisis in the early 2000s, said that now senior executives like the CEO, the CFO, the COO, Chief Operating Officer, are personally responsible if there's a financial problem. Because in the Enron scandal, that those top people said they weren't. So they changed the law and said you are responsible for it. The problem is they're not responsible if there's a data breach that can affect you because there's nothing in the law that makes them responsible for it. Does that make sense?
Seems like that should change.
I would think it would be, but that's one of the legal problems associated with data breaches, and that's one reason why data breaches are basically pervasive in our society nowadays. Another unique aspect of the United States is there is no national data breach law. There's no federal law. There is one for all the states and territories, but of course they vary because they're each individual states and territories. And that kind of makes the whole thing all that more confusing because there is the one national standard. Now, I think there should be at least one national standard. The problem is that for some people, it creates a disincentive for reporting. Because then if they don't report and they can kind of cover it up, then it reduces the probability that they're going to get sued by somebody over something.
So using the John Dillinger analogy, John, and the other gangsters of that era, when they were robbing a bank, they would be perhaps there might be a security guard there, maybe armed security guard, but that's pretty much it. They would walk in and demand the loot and make a fast getaway. So the cost to the bank was essentially, if they chose to employ a security guard, the salary, the cost of that one security guard. In the case of these massive data banks and cloud storage systems, I wonder if the cost of security is equally small that they're paying. In other words, they're not really putting a lot of money into protecting all of those assets.
Well, actually, the bigger organization is, the more their reputation is tied to data security, the more effort they're willing to put into it. Google, Amazon, Facebook, big ones like that tend to have the best cybersecurity because if something goes wrong, it's going to blow up on the national news and a whole bunch of people's feeds, and they're going to suffer reputational damages, and other businesses may not want to work with them in the future. It's the smaller organizations that have the worst cybersecurity because they can't afford to pay all the high salaries of a team of people. They can't afford to have the best cybersecurity techniques and training. It's hard to stop a phishing exploit without training. Phishing attacks are fairly difficult to stop electronically. That's why they're used pervasively. But that means you have to have training. And big organizations can afford to do training for all their folks, and small organizations make it's harder for them to do it. And so most of the more attractive ones for hackers are the smaller organizations that may not have all the tools and techniques in place and may be more vulnerable than the bigger ones.
Yeah, it's just become the background noise of life, these data breaches. They happen. It's a ritual. They happen. You get an email saying something bad happened, and we're going to give you a free year of credit monitoring if you want to go through the hassle of establishing an account and all of that kind of information. So I like the analogy of the bank robbers of the 20s and 30s because in those days, it was happening quite frequently, especially during the Great Depression. And not just the big glamorous names of Dillinger and Ma Barker and Pretty Boy Floyd and the rest, but it was prevalent in the 30s. And it sort of seems the same way right now, although it's a lot more sophisticated and hidden and clean. And as you say, many of these heists we're not even aware of, and even the companies aren't even aware of. Imagine being a bank back then and having been robbed and not knowing it.
Yeah, there is one difference. Back then, they stole a physical object, a dollar bill, a $5 bill, a bearer bond. Nowadays, hackers typically copy it. The information is useful to them. Now, there are some what's called ransomware attacks and stuff like that where they do more than that. But most hackers try to go in there and copy the data because the data in their hands is valuable. And plus, it reduces the hassles associated with getting caught if you can go in there and take the stuff and nobody's the wiser. So there's a little bit difference there, but in terms of value and in terms of approach, it's not that much different. And yeah, I agree, these breach notifications are pervasive. There's one report, a survey that said that 80% of people last year in a 12-month period received a breach notification, and some
Wow.
received multiple. Now, I think that's kind of high, but maybe they mean households because I didn't receive one, for example, last year, but my wife did. And I hate to say it, these breach notifications show you that your data is not that important to the company that got breached. And the reason you can tell is that the FBI says the biggest problem people are confronting is phishing, is getting scammed via phishing. And the breach notifications typically only include credit monitoring and do nothing to affect the largest threat to most people. If they really cared about people, they would include things like phishing training and things like that, and not credit monitoring. So you can tell it's not that important. You can tell it's almost like a rote thing that companies go through to
Right.
cover their ass legally, to be honest
No,
with you.
it's the cost of doing business,
Ex-
a very small civil fine.
exactly. The other thing, too, is I don't think people realize or how pervasive these hacks are. For example, in 2024, 1 billion records were stolen in the US. That means 1 billion, essentially, a record is an entry. 1 billion entries were stolen across the United States for so multiple things can be stolen about you from multiple companies, depending on what type of information they collect about you. So it's just very pervasive. And also, most people don't understand the degree to which companies collect an enormous amount of information about us, even if, let's say, we're not on the internet. I've heard older people say, well, I'm not on the internet, so I'm not vulnerable to scams. Unfortunately, if you do banking, if you
Right.
have a kind of unique account at a grocery store that uniquely identifies you as a person, if you belong to an organization that collects information about you, if you drive around in a car that has a license plate and there's a license plate reader system in that city or organization, then somebody is collecting a whole lot of information about you. And if one of these organizations that's collecting information gets hacked, then your information is available to scammers, irrespective of whether you're on the internet or not.
That's right. If you're, let's say that you go to a baseball game. Nowadays, you can get in by just showing your face. You don't have to go stand through line. You just walk down a particular corridor or path, and you're hardly aware, but there's a picture being taken because they already have that from a previous purchase that you made. And I've been part of this program, and I love it because you can get into Nationals Park here in Washington, D.C. quite quickly without having to hand over your phone, for example, or try to mess with the turnstile. But that picture, which is never flattering, by the way, it's always the worst picture, like a driver's license picture, terrible picture, but still it gets you inside. It's the open sesame. But that picture can be stolen.
Sure, of course it can. In the United States, there's the HIPAA law, which protects data collected by medical service providers, but that's a fairly small, that's like hospitals and things like that. So they can get in trouble, but they also can get hacked. My wife works at a medical service provider, and she got a breach notification last year. And see, that is the scary stuff because they can know a lot about people's medical.
Oh, sure.
So if, Miss Jane Smith, who's 78 and living in Peoria, Illinois, if her medical system gets hacked, somebody can call her up and say, "Oh, Jane, I'm sorry about your psoriasis." And it can be kind of freaky for her. And it's like, well, we need some money right away on psoriasis research. And she'll say, "Oh, okay, yeah, sure, I'll be happy to help." And it's like, "Thank you very much."
Oh, it's terrible.
I know it
Yeah.
is, it's terrible, but that's the problem
Hmm.
with these, what are called backend, server side and enterprise data backend system hacks is people can get a lot of information about you that's collected by another party and can learn quite a bit about you. And it is like the 1920s with banks. I mean, hackers can get away with it. It's very lucrative for them. There's all kind of vulnerabilities out there. And you're right, people have become inured to the background noise of data breaches, and they don't think it'll affect them, but they don't know because it might in the future.
Hmm. Okay, there was one thing I was wondering about, which is we're talking about artificial intelligence all the time nowadays. AI, AI, AI this, AI that. It is sophisticated, and it is pretty good, and I can only imagine that AI will have some kind of role in data theft, making it even easier, perhaps, for people to get in to steal data from servers. What do you think of that? Is AI is that the next frontier in fraud?
That's a good question. The current frontier is what's called hacking as a service, where you don't have to be a particularly sophisticated tech nerd to get access to a whole lot of hacking tools out there. You can literally sort of buy it off the shelf kind of thing and then employ it against whatever target you want. That's the current state of technology. It's kind of like software as a service where you don't have to have the software on your machine. You can just use it whenever you want. And then when you're done using it, then you stop paying for it. AI will undoubtedly be integrated into that somehow. I'm not sure how. Unfortunately, hackers are endlessly creative about this because it is so lucrative. They will use the same tools that everybody else uses, and AI is in fact simply a tool. And I'm sure they will integrate it somehow, and I'm sure they will integrate it via voice and video and fingerprint copying and maybe some medical stuff. But it's only a matter of time before they do it. I'm just am not sure exactly how they will do it.
So all this theft going on, and there's probably been things that have been stolen from me, and I have no idea that it's been stolen. But so far as I know, John, I have not suffered a single cent in loss. I don't know if that's true, but I can't identify any particular damage to me, despite the fact that there have been thefts and data breaches, and I get these notices in the mail. But so far, so good. I wonder
Well,
if that's typical.
fortunately, yes. According to the FBI, again, elder fraud is on the rise across America. It's the most attractive type of fraud because boomers, such as ourselves, and the older population we're talking to, have about half of the assets in the United States. So it's an attractive target. Older people, such as ourselves, also tend to be the least computer savvy. Younger people who are grown up and lived around computers tend to be a lot savvier about them because maybe they got burned a decade ago and now they're a little bit more sanguine. Older people tend to be less savvy. Older people also tend to be less aware of the problems like we're talking about today. How much the internet is ingrained in all of our lives and how much data is collected about us, whereas younger people tend to be a little smarter about that, I would
Mhm.
say, on
Hmm.
balance. And so you're fortunate for most people, most of the time, their money is not stolen from them. Fortunately, there are enough safeguards in place, and hopefully, people are aware of the risks, and hopefully podcasts like this help people. But it does happen, and it's one of these things that you constantly have to be vigilant about because you don't know what data has been stolen and you don't know how it might be deployed against you or against even people you know who might, try to convince you that some scam they've seen online or heard online are worth investing in, something like that.
So that's really the weak link. Okay, recognizing that these data breaches are happening all the time and that companies pay a very low price for data breaches that impact you and me. Nevertheless, the weak link is ourselves. That if our data is being stolen and it's used against us, many times it's used against us, and I'm asking if this is true, John. Is it true that many times it's used against us because of our own behavior when we get a phone call that says, oh, you've got psoriasis and we would like you to be part of a study, and all it costs is $20 to be part of this study, and this will go a long way to solving the heartbreak of psoriasis. Ordinary individuals like you and I, are we the weak link here?
More and more so, yes. More and more scammers have turned into essentially con men. As we've talked about in other podcasts, it's too hard to steal data from our phones and devices itself. So instead, they turn to phishing, which is essentially a con. They try to con you into making you believe that they're somebody different than they are, and you willingly give up your data.
Well, and they also have some information on you, so they can artfully use that to rip you off.
Yes. And that's where the data from these third party sources that they acquire somehow is very useful to them. It helps them narrow the field, it helps them understand the probability, it may help them understand your specific vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it just seems like we're getting nowhere with the data thefts. I mean, they just happen all the time, part of the background. As you say, it's a low cost to companies.
Yeah, my theory is that there has to be a legislative change. There has to be a law that makes it more difficult for senior executives in companies that get hacked to sweep it under the rug. There has to be some kind of risk for them, career or financially, so they have to be involved and they have to care. Unfortunately, there's nothing like that. And I hate to say it, part of the problem too is that the people in Congress tend to be much older and they are not as tech savvy as the younger people. So unfortunately, it may take a generational change in
Yes.
Congress to make it so it has enough of a critical mass for people to care about this stuff. Unfortunately, by then, a lot of people have to suffer and get ripped off before that is going to happen. So there's going to have to be some kind of changes. And also, Congress is going to have to want to be more proactive toward foreign hackers, specifically Chinese, Russian, who are bad actors who want to steal things from us. There has to be consequences for them, and currently there are very few consequences for them. And I should put North Korea in that pile too.
Yeah, it's a buffed up John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd and Ma Barker. Instead of robbing banks, they're kind of hunched over in data banks, stealing quietly, copying really, just copying, as you say, surreptitiously our most sensitive data. And most of the time, we don't even know it's happening, and neither do the companies.
Yeah.
No, it's a discouraging situation, John, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, I know. But people need to be aware of this, and hopefully this podcast will help. And as you've said, I will end this podcast by saying, don't be afraid because modern scams are just old scams in shiny new packages. And I hope we've made that evident during this podcast. Thank you, Don.
All right, we'll talk later.